Wonderful. So hi there.
Hello.
Welcome to the Media Education Lab webinar called The Rifts Between Us. My name is Renee Hobbs, and we are here with a really interesting group of people to engage in a dialogue. We're thinking about the way in which disciplines and domains of knowledge tend to create silos and rifts, and we're wondering about how we can remove those rifts to accelerate innovation and learning. And so we thought what we would do is introduce ourselves to you by means of a little annotation activity. First, we'll ask our dialogic partners, Christian Shockey, Mark Johnson, and Paul Johnson, to share with us a little bit about how they perceive the risks. Then we'll open it up to the group of folks who are on the line, all of you who've joined us today, for you to share how you understand the rifts. So let's use this annotation tool on Zoom. What do you think about my abstract representation of a rift, Christian?
It's what it feels like a lot of times. It's spot on, I think. I feel like the little lines that you've drawn through is very much what it feels like to try and navigate around that rift.
Nice. So Christian, can you start us off by introducing yourself to us and placing two words or icons or symbols, or to put something on the annotated screen that depicts your understanding of what do the rifts, how do you experience the rifts? What do the rifts mean to you?
Yeah. So I'm Christian Shockey. I work for Pathwright as our head of education labs. I've worked for Pathwright now for about 7 years. I think of myself as an educator first, but I'm someone who gets to spend a lot of time with tools and helping educators use tools in really creative ways. And Renee and I have been working together on some really fun things for the last few months, and it's been some of the most fulfilling creative design work. But in my role at Pathwright, I feel like I run into a lot of these rifts pretty often. The first one that came to mind when I was thinking about this is a rift between the tool and teacher. This rift shows up in a couple of different ways. Sometimes this rift shows up because of a lack of access. Teachers just don't have access or an understanding of the tools that they need or how to use those tools well. I think, for instance, my landlord is a fifth grade teacher, and in his mid to late 60s, and he's been thrown into the world of online teaching this year. And really, it was a learning curve. He was willing, but he'd never really had the training. He doesn't even know what tools are out there for him to access. But I think the other reason that I've seen for this rift is because of a lack of trust. I think if you're a really teachery teacher and you care deeply about human interaction, that sometimes we mistrust tools because we think that they're going to take away the things that we love about teaching, or we think that they're going to distance us from our learners. So that was the first big one, I think, that I felt. But I'd love to hear, Renee, from you. What was the first rift that came to your mind?
Well, thank you for asking. And I feel like in some ways the rift that I am really interested in right now is the rift between the teacher and the instructional designer. That would be people like you, Christian, who are kind of like responsible for having technology get used, right? I have been a little bit worried that in higher education, when the skills of being the instructional designer are outsourced to a professional, that the teacher always exists in a conflicted perspective toward those tools. And I have observed that in K-12 education, where I do a lot of work, often the teacher herself or himself has to be their own instructional designer.
Yes.
And it turns out they do innovative, amazing things that you never would have imagined. So that's the rift I'm interested in. Now, Paul, could you introduce yourself to us and talk a little bit about, tell us who you are and tell us a little bit about how you perceive the rifts between us.
Sure. Hi, Renee, and it's great to be here with you all. I'm Paul Johnson. I am one part of the twin duo that founded Pathwright. So Mark will introduce himself to you in just a second. But Mark and I got into designing and creating software when we were about 13 years old, and we never stopped. And so we also had like a kind of an unconventional education, and we're interested in education software very early. And so Pathwright was kind of our dream project when we landed on that idea in around 2009, and we've just grown it ever since. So we've been thinking about education and technology and that intersection for a very long time. And I think one of the main rifts that I see, and this is kind of like a meta rift to me, and it might take a little bit of explanation. And I've actually got some drawings I could share a little bit later, perhaps, to drill into this a little more. But is the rift between the people that create content. So they organize and generate kind of the informational knowledge in the world. And yeah, so you could call them creators. But these are people that are figuring out how the world works, and then the people that are actually teaching using the content. And I think, Renee, this is very similar probably to the gap and the rift that you're seeing as well. But to me, I see that as like not just within academia or within K through 12 schools, just across the board for all of humanity, there is a big gap between people who create the content that we learn from and that we use and adapt, and the teachers who are doing the adaptation. And to me, that's where technology should come in and solve that kind of problem, because it can, but it hasn't. And so I've got a lot of thoughts on why that is and some examples I could show later, but that's the one that I'm focusing on.
What a great way to introduce yourself to us. And you could see the heads nodding around the room that you definitely tapped into something. Mark, can you introduce yourself and talk to us about how you understand the rifts between us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I'm Mark. I'm Paul's twin here in the bubble. Like Paul said, we did have a bit of an unconventional education, so I think it kind of makes us think a bit unconventionally about software and the things we do as well. As far as the rifts between us, I think one of the metaphors I remember from school was just that the art building, where part of my education was a completely separate place from the science building, the computer science building. Which, I mean, it wasn't that far away, but they were two separate buildings, two separate spaces, totally different faculties, no intersection of content. And I would go from one to the other because I was my minor was computer science and my major was graphic design. So I'd go from one lab in the computer science building to the lab in the art building. And I was seeing these parallels between what I was learning. So when you're making websites, for instance, or software, that's an art and a science. There's user experience design. There's all kinds of things you have to think about when you're making software, but none of that was brought up in the science side. That was just about the code and whether or not it, functionally works. But that's also part of it too. On the art side, you can make something beautiful, but if it doesn't work, then it's not a good design. And so I saw that very early on. It's these disciplines are just separated physically even on this campus. But it's more than just physical. It's still taught that way. So even when we bring these things online, you'll have computer science classes, then you'll have design classes, but they don't intersect, even though in reality, those intersect all the time.
Wow, really, really nice. Now, in some ways, we've provided a model for those of you who are joining us on the call. We're going to take about 7 or 8 minutes here. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you perceive the rifts between us. Who wants to go first? Lauren?
I can go first. We use Canvas at my campus, and there's nothing very artistic about Canvas or campus for that matter. So that's I don't know. I don't know how engaging it is for my students. And so I'm really interested in something that might be a little bit more engaging, like I was just hearing about the user experience. Canvas is so linear and a lot of my students aren't. So
So you've identified the rift between the learner and the tool as a rift to add to my chart. Wonderful. Cornelia, how do you perceive, introduce yourself to us and tell us how do you perceive the rifts that exist in your world when it comes to technology, learning, teaching, education, creativity, innovation, and all the rest?
All right. Well, hi, everyone. My name's Cornelia Trahan, and I'm a second year student in the PhD program at URI. And I just finished, at the end of July, the Tier 2 program with Renee and company. And I was listening to both speakers and thought, this is another example. I mean, this is obvious, but apparently it's not obvious enough for the change to happen as quickly as it should. The fact that, as it was so aptly described, that there's the science sector, and then there's the artistic sector, and there's this very neat boundary around each one. And it's so obvious as soon as I heard everyone talking today. It's just it's time for these domains to become one more example of the cyclical, innovative design, software, for it all to be this ongoing collaborative experience.
Thank you so much for sharing.
So well put.
Who else in the room would like to offer an introduction and tell us a little bit about how you perceive the rifts between us? I'm looking at all of you, folks without your mic, without your cameras on. Anyone want to pipe up? All right, well, maybe not. You know, Christian, what I hear the themes emerging already are trust, creativity, and I guess I would say epistemological understandings of the nature of knowledge, right? So
yes, yeah, and I love how Cornelia just described this kind of utopia, really, of cyclical innovation. That you know, it's not that we have to cram these disciplines together at every junction, but we need to create spaces for them to talk. We need to create trust between them so that we can share our most essential innovations. I think, Renee, that goes to your point, that when a teacher is thrust into the position of an instructional designer, they innovate because they're bringing a fresh look. And I think it's creating those opportunities, and then maybe even more importantly, listening and watching what happens, and not allowing those ideas to get lost in bureaucracy.
Really, really great point. Robert, I invite you to introduce yourself to us and tell us how you perceive the rifts between us. And then we'll turn it over to Paul. And Paul, you can talk a little bit more about how you, the way you see this problem as a design problem and how to address it. But Robert, introduce yourself to us. How do you see the rifts between us?
Yeah, I'm Robert Barrett. I'm at the University of Illinois. We have a big center for innovation in teaching and learning, and it's wonderful because it's a really large center because we have instructional designers, we've got pedagogy folks, ed tech folks, media team, marketing team, all kinds of stuff. And just, you know, like any organization, the disciplinary differences are in there between the instructional designer, the media folks, and the pedagogy folks. And our whole strategic plan is to do better at collaborating and coordinating because everybody has something to bring together. But, you know, if your whole career has been about media, you approach things in a certain way. And if your whole career has been sort of pedagogy and teaching and learning support, you approach things. And we all know that we'll do better if we can come together in that way. And then I'll throw in one last rift. I'm still surprised, remote teaching, the whole world's doing it now across the country. And there's still this rift between kind of the those that have fully embraced online learning and have that experience in technology and knowledge, and the more traditional teachers who, you know, are still thinking about blended and flipped. So everybody's sort of doing online teaching now, but there's still this rift between the sort of the cultures and the traditions, I think.
Wow,
Well
beautifully said. Thanks for sharing.
So I think it'd be really interesting. This is emerging pretty naturally. I would love, Paul, if you wouldn't mind showing us the map of how some of these silos have developed, how we have found ourselves in this kind of disjointed educational landscape. How did this happen? How did we get into this kind of rifted position?
Great. All right. So I've got a map up here. Are you all seeing me in the bottom left corner of the screen hanging out? Okay, in front of a black square. Okay. So this is an idea that we think about at Pathwright. It's kind of how we view actually the ed tech landscape. So all the technology that people use. And like whether it's an LMS or it's a classroom tool, it's like a macro level view of it. But underneath kind of that macro level view of technology is actually the rift that I highlighted earlier, which is kind of the rift between what I would describe as content and teaching. So on the bottom here, let's see. Okay, so on the bottom axis here of this map, we've got two axes here. We'll put content, and on the left side, these would be people that just use content. So like often a teacher in a classroom will just like a lot of times remix curriculum that somebody else has published and wrote. And some teachers will kind of add their own thoughts to it, or sometimes even create original content. But often they're just using it. So that the left end of the map is just people that are adapting and using the content. And then on the very right side of this axis here, we've got people who are creating new content. So these are like authors, and they may or may not be instructional designers. Like that comes into play once the knowledge is created and packaged in some form. So this might be like original research and people that are thinking and organizing information. On the vertical axis, we put teaching. And so this one's a little bit simpler. So on the bottom side of this, we've got one teacher. So a single teacher in a classroom or a teacher in a small group. And then at the top, we've got many teachers that are collectively teaching together in some organizational way. So we might plot a teacher here. So that's like a single teacher in a classroom. And then a school, we might kind of connect this way. So we've got a bunch of teachers connected together through some kind of network that we call a school. This could also just be any kind of organization that's educational in nature. And then over here on this side, we might have like a creator. So somebody who creates, this could be like educational YouTube videos, could be an author of an educational book or some kind of instructional design content. And they may or may not be teaching on the other side of the map as well, but often they're really focused on that creative act and organizing and creating new knowledge. And then on the top, we've got publishers. So that's a bunch of people organized into a network to create things under one brand and one distribution arm, usually. So everybody, I think, is familiar with the publishers, especially in the education world. And, you know, in a ideal world, you know, what would be the relationship between all of these four areas? I think somebody actually mentioned it earlier. I think it was, let's see, I'm looking at my notes. I think it was Cornelia mentioned that it should be like a cyclical kind of innovative process. So like ideally, it would look something like this, where people are generating new content and then people are teaching it, and that there's a virtuous cycle between how that is adapted based on how well like it works and how well it lands. And then often, like Renee mentioned, K through 12 teachers who may have no background in instructional design, but now are like teaching online, come up with like really amazingly creative ways to do things. And ideally that kind of informs the content as well and how it's presented and designed and packaged. And so that's the way, you know, it seems like it should work. However, the big challenge I think that exists right now is that the amount of time, so we see on that bottom axis there's a huge amount of time that it takes to get published content into the hands of a teacher of any kind and them to be able to use it. So like the textbook publishing cycle is kind of like a classic example. Like it takes years to put together the version of the textbook, and once it goes to print, like it's done and it's distributed. And then of course they're going to do a new edition later. But that time cycle is so high energy and cost inefficient that it really, what it does is it creates these silos, basically. So we've got actually silos on both sides. You've got silos between teachers who teach in schools at the top and publishers, like the big textbook publishers. But it's also true at the bottom side too, is like you've got kind of silos between people who create individual, like they create online courses, for instance, and the people who actually teach in a classroom. That silo is a little bit less, time dependent, but it's still like siloed off. And, ideally what technology would do is something like this. Technology would kind of close the gap and reduce the time, because it doesn't take any time at all, of course, to like publish something to the internet. And then once you publish it, there's no reason not to keep updating it. And wouldn't it be especially great if you could update it based on what you're seeing from the performance of the content? But instead, what technology has evolved to do is, instead of making that virtuous cycle, we get technology that is organized around market segments. So in this top segment, we have LMSs like Canvas and Brightspace and Blackboard, and they're only really trying to serve that specific customer, like a school with a bunch of teachers in a classroom, and it's like this organization tool, assuming that the education is happening elsewhere. And then in this bottom left, we've got kind of more individual classroom focused tools towards like individual teachers, like Google Classroom and Edmodo and Schoology. And these are like tools that are oriented towards individual teachers. And then over here on the content side, we've got a lot of like kind of content selling and marketing packaged software like Teachable and Podio and Thinkific. And then up here in the publishing side, they usually have enough money that they make their own kind of digital version of whatever their textbooks are that no one really likes to use. So there's not really like platforms that support these, but they tend to develop custom software. And so what we can see here is that technology has not done anything innovative here. Instead, what they've done is actually tried to take the market opportunity from these silos that already existed. And those silos didn't exist because they needed to, or they should. They existed because of the limitations of publishing. And so that's what's kind of created this big rift in my mind. That's kind of like this meta rift that exists across like all education in all cultures. And that's like a particular problem that we're like very interested in solving. So what we think about a lot is like, how could we kind of close that gap and bring people kind of together in the middle? So that's kind of like how we think about what ed tech should do at Pathwright. So of course we're trying to do stuff like that, but that's what we also think, ed tech should do in education. Just one of the things. There's other things too, of course.
So that is absolutely so fascinating. Now, will you do me a favor? Will you go back to the previous slide? Because I want to see how people weigh in on these four silos as a rift. How do you, I invite you to comment on this model that's been set up. What's your perspective on Paul's model? How does it resonate with your experience? What do you notice about it? Who wants to go first?
I could even further break down the rifts within each of those squares.
Say more.
The rifts on my campus of people who even use Canvas and who don't. The rifts within schools of teachers who adopt classroom tools and the ones who don't, for the very reasons that we talked about at the beginning. So, I mean, I think you could just break this down and down and down and down. But it's fascinating to see it laid out like this. It's fascinating.
Thank you for sharing other perspectives.
I can jump in, Renee. The one point that comes back to me is that the market opportunity is enforcing the silos. It's just because that's the priority and the need to have proprietary products. The boundaries and the walls I think are really driven by the markets. And so it's so beautiful. I'm looking at the division here in the lower right. We have the content, the creators, And typically, the creative design folks, this is a real generalization, but very often they're very free with their product, whether it's Linux, whatever it is. And then the right above that is the polar opposite. And again, generalizing, there's a really, it's very siloed, and it's almost, its priority is protection as opposed to serving the majority and really addressing the needs. So it's almost like it's a twofold experience, where these corporations are addressing their profit margin, but at the same time they have to serve the consumer. But you can see there's a conflict between the two, and that's enforcing the silos.
Thanks for sharing. Kate, Robert, any perspectives on how do you react to this really interesting model?
One of the things that seems missing to me are the ultimate technologists, and those are the people who create the technology that we use in the classroom. And one of the things that's kind of disturbing to me is that I've been doing this for a long time. I've been in educational media, and it seems to me that the tools are not getting easier to use. They're getting harder, they're getting more complex. And we increasingly see students complaining about the fact that they're all online now, and they have like a gazillion different tools that they have to keep track of. And that's like the number one complaint that we get is, I don't have one place I can go to kind of keep me on track. And I know there are tools for that out there as well, but I really wonder sometimes how much these, and I used to be in making educational software. I used to be part of a team that made educational software, and I just wonder how much they really do interact with users and hear what users think, both the users who are doing the instruction and the students, about how they feel about the technology and the direction that they would like to see technology go in.
Wow, that is a very, very good point. Robert, and I see Fred Haas has also joined us. Welcome. So we're commenting on this very interesting model that Paul has put forward, and we're trying to reflect on it and how we interpret it in relation to our own practice. So I invite you, Robert or Fred or anyone else who's on the call, tell us what you think about what ideas are stimulated by this interesting chart.
I would add if you look at, we've got the quadrants, but actually there's already been some commentary about the top and the bottom seems to be a big schism, right, between the masses and the money-making opportunities, and then things happening at the individual level, on the lower level. So, we've got teaching and content and creators and users, but, there is a big rift between the top. There's enough of an audience to make an effort of it, and then the individual activity below, that's a big thing. I don't know how we deal with that. There's this is intriguing to try to look at things in different ways like this.
Mark, I would like to put you on the spot a little bit and hear your thoughts on the rift between how tools work and the way people learn, because oftentimes it seems like there's a big gap between those two things.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in anyway, so thanks, Christian. Yeah, I think I really like that point that was brought up earlier from Kate, that oftentimes it seems like these tools are not designed with the user in mind, or even with like the user's input in some cases. And that is 100% correct. So like back to Paul's model, the business forces around those. And we saw this very early on when we were starting Pathwright. Like we went through like a small incubator program and getting advice and like mentorship from, you know, venture capitalists and all that kind of thing. And we never went down that road fully. We've bootstrapped it, but partially for this reason, because what they'll tell you is that you have to pick a market segment. You have to. You're going to, like, unless you pick like, you know, one of these areas to really focus on, your business is just not going to take off. And in the short term, that's true. Like if you're looking for a quick turnaround, like a 10x return in 5 years, which is what these investors are looking for, that is absolutely true. You got to go after the one with the most numbers and the one that you have the most traction in, and you just have to hone in on that. And so those market forces end up creating or reinforcing actually the silos that already exist, because they're not trying to create a new market. They're just going into an existing space. And so what ends up happening is the other kind of like invisible thing there that is very important is that the people they're marketing to in those spaces are not necessarily the end user of the product. And so for instance, in the LMS space, this is very obvious. Most of those software decisions are made by administrators who never actually use the software themselves. And so oftentimes it's like some combination of the IT department and the administration team and like the finance people. And yeah, they'll have like a token teacher or student thrown in, but the board overall is not really the users of the product. And the software companies know this, and they're trying to sell to a particular type of user. And so they orient the features, like towards the people who are making the decisions, which is often like some sort of big checklist you get from a consultant. And so they're going to try to, it creates like a feature arms race. And I think Kate mentioned this too, where it's like, there's so many things and like so few of those things are used. And I think even with tools like Canvas that are maybe a little bit better than some of the other ones, there are still so many options. And part of the reason for that is just because they're trying to keep up with these checklists from these consultants who are informing these boards to make these decisions. Right. And it's a purely business thing. It's not a functional thing at all. And it's not because students are asking for that. It's not necessarily even because teachers are asking for that. It's just because it's on these checklists. And it also orients the way that the disposition of the company towards the schools, because they're primarily interested in that top level decision-making process. So a lot of whining and dining, a lot of sales, they're investing tremendous amounts of their budget in that rather than the actual software that the students have to like struggle with every day. And so that just tends to happen, like, especially the more successful in the business market a company gets, actually the less usable the software tends to trend. And we've seen that like over and over again.
You know, it so resonates, Mark, what you're saying in terms of my own love-hate relationship with the International Society for Technology Education, otherwise known as ISTE, right? So this is a very large group, a conference, a group of folks who gather annually for events and programs. And in the 25 years ago, they were a group of folks who were more closely connected to the practices of teaching and learning at the grassroots level. And as the organization has grown, and with the infusion of the, what did they say it is? Like $600 billion in investment in ed tech over the last several years, the feel of that gathering has been more explicitly promotional and explicitly framed around influencing, like you said, the sort of district and school leaders at the systems level. And the further and further away from thinking about the learner and the teacher and the complex dialectic process of what it means to create learning environments. And so I'm making a connection around how your observation about the market like affects my experience of trying to be a learner in the conference context, because I am not in some ways the target audience for ISTE, right? Right? So, but in some ways, I think the feelings of helplessness that faculty and students can experience in the face of these, the norms for using platforms is something that we're trying to confront right now, right? Something that we're trying to find workarounds to the rift.
Yeah, well, I think this is all brilliant stuff, guys. Really good. I mean, I think the biggest rift of all you guys have nicely uncovered, which is even our own diagram here. It's not learner centered, especially in the big Blackboard and the big companies and stuff. But that's very perceptive, that, yeah, they're marketing to me, they're not marketing to the students. And so how would we get back to educational technologies that's actually learner centered? We have a new Siebel Center for Design on our campus. It's kind of like the Stanford model, but it's all human centered design. And I guess you can have human centered design if the person buying your product aligns with the user of the product, right? And that you can sort of try to do the best you can. But it seems like that's the biggest rift of all, is that it's not our students or learners that actually get to vote on any of this stuff, apparently.
I think that's really well said, Robert. And I actually want to use that as an opportunity to ask Paul, in what ways can design and design thinking be an antidote to this mess that we've got ourselves in? How can it bridge the gaps between these divides?
Yeah, great question. And I think not only could it be the anecdote, I think it has to be, because I think that's the only kind of solution, is the kind of empathetic process that actually teachers are very good at already, like putting themselves in the shoes of their learners and students and trying to meet them exactly where they are. And they express that in the way that they teach and the way that they plan their lessons. Hopefully an education technology company would also be trying to express that in the way that they design their UIs, but it's really the same starting point. And that's where I like what Robert pointed out about the kind of vertical rift between publishers and creators and teachers and institutions. Is I think that the solution will have to be both technology companies and individual creators and individual teachers kind of working at that level, because they're the closest to the student. Like, they have the skin in the game on whether or not its success is achieved and whether or not something needs to be changed. And then it could happen like bottom up. But I don't think with our given scenario, with the way that the publishing market works, the way that academia is structured and the administration of it particularly, is probably not likely to come top down. It's probably going to have to happen bottom up. And it's going to take that kind of empathetic collaboration between the practitioners, the teachers, and the creators themselves. And actually, the encouraging thing is that it already is happening. It's just happening outside the system. Like, people are having to find workarounds, and they're doing great work, like finding those workarounds and coming up with creative ways to use things like YouTube and social media and other tools that are non-traditional and not officially supported by the institution that they're part of.
Yeah, I want to give a shout out to Fred. Fred, in the chat, you made some really interesting point. Can you make it in the voice and make the connection there, because it seems like so perfectly ripe what was just said.
So, I mean, the first thing I guess I would say is, when I look at this, one of the problems that I've probably had with learning management systems since the sort of inception of them is that they are really management solutions. They're not really learning solutions. And they privilege certain pedagogical decisions that are made because it's easier. Like, it's much easier. Like, it's great. Like, I got Canvas. I can make a multiple choice quiz faster, but that isn't necessarily what I want to do as a teacher. And it isn't necessarily the best way to learn. So I have a tool to do things faster that I don't really need. And, conversely, I actually started to kind of get into a couple other ideas, but, as you move down in the lower right corner, we've got this sort of content area, but I think and I came in late, so I could be off base here, but I think one of the things that's really missing here is, like, where is the student or where is the learner? Because, like, content or curriculum is not a book or a box or a bunch of files on a computer somewhere. The students are part of the curriculum. Like, the people that are present in whatever space is constructed, they are like active agents in shaping the curriculum. And a lot of the tools really can't accommodate that, because they're meant to sort of, exercise control. and they narrow choices because that's what computers do. Like in a lot of ways, like on a fundamental level, is they narrow choices. So it isn't necessarily helpful. I mean, I would also say that, I mean, I think I've used maybe 6 or 7 different LMSs at this point in my career, and none of them are particularly great. And they all tend to be like sort of very behavioristic models. And so they just perpetuate that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it seems kind of in summation of the last 10 minutes or so that we find ourselves in this bind where we keep passing down the same problem. The technology that's created tells the teachers how to teach in a particular way instead of adopting to how they teach. And then it's passed down to the learner, telling them to learn in a particular way instead of observing and adapting to how they want to learn and how they learn naturally. You know, I think, Mark, to your point, most technology just doesn't feel like how we actually want to learn. It doesn't feel like a process of discovery or exploration.
I would tend to agree with that, absolutely tend to agree with that. But I feel like there's something happening now, post-pandemic, or not, we're not post-pandemic, sorry. I like to think we are, but something happened during the pandemic as those of us who were teaching online began to live our lives on Zoom and started to think about the intimate interplay between anytime learning that happens on a platform and under the learner's own control, and real-time learning, which is being in a learning community like we are right now at this very moment, in a learning community. And as we start thinking about those two together, I feel like some new, more than ever now, I feel like online learning is beginning to approximate the richness and depth of opportunity for both teachers and learners. So I wonder about how you perceive the relationship between synchronous platforms like the one we're using right now with Zoom in relation to the non-synchronous learning platforms. Is there an opportunity there for a rift to be bridged between those two things?
I certainly think so. And Paul, I want to hear from you on this. My kind of short take is that the reason why that is a rift at all is that very thing that Fred was saying and Robert was saying, that the tool drives the experience instead of the experience the tool. And really, they've become cages instead of, you know, I'm using a hammer to hammer in nails, right? You want to use the tool for what it's made for, not try to force it to do something that it's not. But Paul, I'd love to hear your answer to that question.
Yeah, I think that's a really good kind of rift that is new to the conversation, but very real, is like the kind of disjointed nature of synchronous events like this and the asynchronous learning. And both of us learn in both of those modes, of course, all the time, but they're so disjointed within the technology that we have to use different tools for them. And some of that is like a legitimate technology limitation with bandwidth and hardware, but more and more it's not. It's actually, that gap is kind of closed fairly rapidly with the hardware and the bandwidth side, but it's still there to a degree. But I think a bigger issue is kind of a lack of imagination for how to solve that particular problem. And also kind of like what Fred mentioned before is like, LMSs are management tools. They're not meant to create experiences. Like that's kind of one of the biggest things we realized, 9 years ago when we started thinking about Pathwright, is like, why are these tools so bad, was the question we were asking. And then we figured it out. It's like, because it assumes that the learning experience is happening elsewhere, and that all I'm providing is a utilitarian, like Dropbox like folder for people to share their syllabus and to sync their calendars and to take files digitally. And that's kind of what most teachers tend to use it for. And, of course they've built out all the bells and whistles for the reasons that Mark mentioned, but they never really started with a premise that we're going to create an engaging, immersive, actual human feeling learning experience online. And that's why even when they've gotten more usable, they still feel like very kind of bland and unimaginative and like unengaging. They're like these gray boxes. I think Lauren mentioned that. And so there's just a whole lot of lack of imagination, I would say, in the kind of technology design of the software itself. And then I think there's an interesting example to look at. Maybe you've come across this already, but there's a design tool that is rapidly replacing like Photoshop, for example, for graphic designers or web designers, and it's called Figma. And the cool thing about it is, and you can go to their website and you can sign up for it, but it's completely online. It's like every bit as robust as any kind of hardware, like specific software you'd use, like Photoshop. But I mean, it's not for photos, it's for design, but it's also got this live multiplayer layer on it. So like if Christian and Mark and I are working on a design in Figma for a UI or something, like we can see like the avatar for exactly where the person is, like what they're looking at. And then you can just drop a comment right there and do a live chat. And people have actually started using it as like an alternative to a forum. Like, so they'll make a landscape in Figma, and then they'll have these chat rooms that are kind of spatially mapped. And so all these creative things happened around this design tool because they added that live layer, and they didn't start with the assumption like, oh, you got to save an image and then you've got to email it or post it for somebody else to download it. And then they're going to asynchronously work on it, and then they're going to pass it back. And that's kind of how the whole world thinks. But that's like that comes from the world of paper when you had to like make something physically and send it. So I think the web is actually just kind of on the cusp you can see it in tools like Figma. There's another tool that's amazing for note-taking app called Roam Research that kind of changed a paradigm change for information organization. But we're seeing, it's really exciting actually, like even as of like this year and the last year, like people are actually for the first time starting to reimagine, what technology could actually do, and not just kind of like try to fit within the boxes we already have in a market focused way. So.
Wow. Very thoughtful. And I want to call out Erin Cruz's great comment in the chat because it so relates to what you just said. She writes, one of my big frustrations in the UI UX seems outdated often with EdTech as compared to, say, social media. Experiences are not as developed and as advanced as gaming experiences. And she basically worries a little bit about the a ton of good ideas, but the focus on protectiveness and competing. And that actually connects back to something, Kate, you mentioned in the chat. I wonder if you could share that idea about tools have been created to promote inquiry learning, but somehow they don't reach the market or they're not successful. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I used to work for a group of computer scientists out at the University of Southern California School of Information Sciences, and I was in a group there that was making educational software. And we're talking about at the level of, this was when, there was a lot of new thinking on using AI in these tools. And so these were pretty sophisticated tools. And as a result, I became aware of the sort of landscape of institutions like this that are basically, they're like thinking labs, right? They're like innovation labs. And they would come up with these prototypes, and some of them were really great and some of them weren't so great. But very few even of the great ones actually made it into the commercial space. So, you would have stuff that would get you really, really excited, and you'd say, oh, I can't wait until that becomes available for classroom teachers because that's going to be a game changer, and it never happened. And I think there must be something in the incentive structure that exists between these spaces where people come up with these ideas, these very creative ideas, and they spend a lot of time looking at how users, that's one of the places where user studies are, they're a big part of what they do. They want to make sure that these resonate with users. And so when you have that kind of innovation going on, and yet somehow that stuff, those ideas don't make it into the marketplace, it sort of suggests that something else there's some disconnect in that sector.
Wow, what a big and beautiful idea. You've introduced yet another rift, right? Our model is getting more interesting by the minute.
Yeah, the
Anybody wanna
educational
respond to
labs.
that? So the rift between the creative innovators in the university labs, right, and the entrepreneurs and the established companies, there's the tension there. And that is a tension that affects what kinds of products come to market and how we think about innovation.
I think the creative innovators are in the labs. I don't want to suggest there's a rift there. Right. I think where the rift is that there's something in the, the people who fund ventures, who venture capitalists who put money behind these ideas. There's something in that process that gets things, where these great ideas drop out or they get watered down in some way so that they are no longer what they were when they were in the lab.
Exactly. So I want to make a comment about how I think digital and media literacy education as a set of instructional practices, how they may help do what Mark and Paul, what you guys think about is bringing together the silos. And to do that, I actually need help from Fred, Lauren, and Cornelia and Christian, because in some way the idea that learners are creators and that teachers are publishers is actually kind of baked into media literacy, right? And I wonder about whether or not it's ridiculous or crazy to think that the instructional practices of media literacy could help with the bringing together, the healing of the rifts. What are your thoughts on that?
All right, so I'm going to think out loud here a little bit on this, but I think that you might be onto something, because I think there needs to be like a frame shift in the sense that to get to those places where we can be more creative, like sometimes that requires breaking down kind of like the cages that we've built for ourselves, right? And so one of the avenues that media literacy may sort of offer is that teachers aren't necessarily the only publishers. Suddenly students become publishers. But I mean, beyond that, I would even sort of go further to say, like, even the idea that like somehow there's like some single solution is really kind of like a fiction, right? Because as technology has proliferated into like every aspect of our lives, things have gotten more complex, not less. They have gotten more volatile, not less. And it puts more of a requirement on being able to navigate these things with some degree of success. And that is part and parcel of the mission of a kind of media literacy, is like, how do you operate in this sort of storm of all these things happening and all these messages bombarding you, right? So, I mean, I think too, like, just look at your phone. Just look at how many apps are on your phone. I mean, and so like, I mean, how many apps you don't even use, you know? So like, like we have to kind of find ways to pilot our way, and they have to be more open, and with greater possibilities sometimes than we're able to even conceptualize initially. Like, it takes time. It's really a process that unfolds.
That's so well said. I think in part, and Fred, you can let me know if you agree with this or not, that in many ways we find ourselves looking for a solution to these rifts, some kind of tech solution. But what we might actually need is, and this is something that media literacy I think could provide, is as well as design thinking, is a shared set of principles or a shared perspective. And because each of these different silos actually not only has its own agenda, but its own set of principles for what is going to mark success, that leads to an inability to collaborate around an effective solution or set of solutions.
And I want to give a very practical example of that, Christian, in terms of work that we did together this summer, because I feel like I'm still reflecting and processing on what we experienced together. When I shared with you this idea that reflection is a huge part of the media literacy pedagogy, right? Access, analyze, create, reflect, act. The question is how to embody reflection in our online Summer Institute. And you showed me the use of a tool that was filed in the Pathwright universe under assessment. You said, Renee, this tool is identified as an assessment tool, but it could be very well used for reflection. You showed me how that happened, and it was like, and I feel like in some ways that story really illustrates how the boxes that we create, this goes back to George Orwell and language and the words we use to label things limits the way we think about things. And that was a really big aha for me. And so I feel like, yeah, we can't sit around waiting for the tools. We have to kind of remove the barriers and think about the underlying principles that we want to privilege. And in this case, it was our privileging of reflection that made it possible to use the tool in a really powerful way.
Yeah, that's really well put. I think we ran into the same thing the other day with using reminders in a creative way, right? Not just to do an administrative task, but actually to kind of extend ourselves out into the learner's environment. I want to ask Mark and Paul as we near the end of our time. What's the language? What are some of the principles that are driving how Pathwright is designed so that it can be a solution or a bridge between some of these rifts? So maybe give me a picture of, what this tool is going to look like and how it can really serve teachers and learners in a year from now and in 5 years from now. What are you envisioning? Because I know you spend a lot of time and have spent a lot of time this summer doing that very thing.
Yeah, it's a big question. So I could talk, for hours about this, but I think the most important thing for us is, I think I'll just highlight two principles. Is one, that we focus on learners first. So when we're building a UI, we always focus on the learner experience first. We don't even build the kind of teaching tools and certainly not the administrative tools. So we kind of work backwards compared to what most technology platforms work on. And it's really important because we want that learner experience to be the best possible experience for them. And that helps, of course, and serves the teacher as well. And then I think the second principle is that we just have working with smart, thoughtful, educators, and to shape out what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, in our DNA. So Mark mentioned earlier, we didn't go the venture capital route. Instead, we've actually had to and enjoyed funding our development of our roadmap from when it was just Mark and I to now where we are now, through partnerships with actual educational institutions and even individual teachers. And that's how we work. So when we're trying to dream up a new design, we're not just thinking about the use cases that have been requested. We're actually often collaborating and talking with educators and listening to what they're doing. And we're teachers ourselves too. Over half of our team are teaching in some way or have taught before. So I think that's the second thing. And then I guess from there, I'm not sharing any specifics. Maybe Mark can share a little bit of those, but from there, it's just we recognize that it's an iterative, evolutionary type of process to develop software in the right way. And we also view it as we've been doing it for 8 years now, but we view it as very much in the infancy as far as what we could be doing and what we're thinking about. And I think that's true not just for ed tech, but across the board. So
wonderful. Oh yeah, Mark.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I think someone else mentioned this too, but one of the things that we always try to do is immerse ourselves in the medium that we're building in. And so we're all using the tool ourselves, in our own team, in our classes, we're teaching and stuff like that. But also we're paying attention to and actively engaging with the emerging patterns in the market. So Paul mentioned the Figma and the Roam tool. Those are two examples, but there's a whole lot of other stuff going on, for instance, in the gaming world with like live events being hosted on Fortnite, for instance. And like at first you might not think that that has anything to do with education, but we think it very much does. And like the future is going to be a lot more immersive than anything like what we have now. And so trying to prepare our platform and our thinking to be ready for that future as well. And also just even experimenting and playing around with those things so that we understand that medium natively enough to be able to actually design with it.
Right, wonderful. Well, Christian and Mark and Paul, I want to thank you for joining us at the Media Education Lab. Let's give them a round of applause. We really benefit from having an opportunity to hear how people who are in the ed tech business are thinking about their work and thinking about the future and thinking about us, the teachers and learners. Stay tuned for more webinars with the Media Education Lab, and thanks so much for joining us today. Bye now.